Hi, David. I feel like I'm home. I know more people here than I do in my own department. So, yeah. Well, we have a lot of turnover in our department. That's yeah, a lot of people left. But yeah. So I think I'm introducing Jasmine and her work. But since I'm the first person up here, maybe I just say welcome to the IRES seminar. And we hold these how often? Every week. Okay, great. Great. But this is the only one I've been invited to. Uh, so let's put a plug in for the adjuncts so that they get invited to these more regularly. And I think that's a good segue. I'm Rob Van Weinsberg. I'm prof in Department of Educational Studies in the Faculty of Education. And I do think I'm an adjunct because associate, is that the right terminology? Right. Which means, and I really like this and appreciate this about IRES, the desire to reach across the campus to get people on committees that would be helpful to the students who are doing their work. So I've done that and enjoyed that a couple of times. I get to learn a great deal, and usually it's along the lines of kind of an educational facet to the research, and that's how Jasmine and I got together. So you had applied, and I think David, you were in the head at the time, reached out and said, would you be interested in working with Jasmine? And I said yes. And so we started working on an idea at the UBC farm, which brings in another element of UBC. And I've always appreciated the UBC farm and thought that the Faculty of Education could do more with that partnership. And we are trying to reinvigorate the children's garden. And we're hoping to create a teaching space on the farm, which is different than a children's learning space. A teaching space would enable educators to learn how to best employ gardens and farms for the purposes of learning and teaching. And it's an incredibly hot topic these days because the federal government has promised $1 billion for school food programs. And the province has brought it to the table, I think, 214 million. So it's quite a timely topic. Jasmine and I were talking about what to do, and I brought this idea up and promised funding, which faculty tend to do. The funding didn't come through, but we continued to work together and are now working on a topic that you're going to learn a little bit about. But I just wanted to say it's been a real pleasure to work with Jasmine because she's been wide open to the idea of introducing some of the educational work that I'm involved in into her work. And that's beneficial, hopefully, to Jasmine. But I think if we're going to be part of this movement called sustainability, that's exactly what we have to do. And I really appreciate the openness and the intellectual curiosity that Jasmine brings. And without further ado, let's turn it over to Jasmine.
Thank you. Okay, let me just get situated here. Oh, I'll just put it here. It's okay. Okay, hi everybody. My name is Jasmine Lambert. I'm a second year MA here at IRES. And today I'm going to be talking to you about my master's research, which is about land-based learning and the UBC Farm Wonders summer camps. Oh, sorry. Oh, just a sec. Okay. So before I get into the details of my research, I'd just first like to acknowledge and express my gratitude to the Musqueam First Nation, of whose land we're all gathered on here today. This campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam First Nation. And Musqueam people have stewarded these lands for over 9,000 years. And since then, this peninsula that we call Point Grey has always been a place of learning and teaching. Helkson, the Hunkaminam word for point of land, continues to be a place where people of all ages are constantly learning and growing, and I'm so thankful to have the opportunity to be one of those people. So it doesn't really make any sense for me to talk to you about my research without first telling you a little bit about myself. So I'm a mixed race uninvited settler here on Musqueam territory. And I spent the first 7 years of my life on Saturna Island, which is one of the Southern Gulf Islands here in BC. And so many days of my childhood were spent in and around the water, with the 310-hectare island being mostly coastline and forest. And so when I lived there, there were about 300 permanent residents, and the doctor would visit every Tuesday. I think now they're up to about 350 permanent residents, so they're getting bigger. But the Tsawut and the Tsakum First Nation of the Wasanich First Nation knew Tektexin, or East Point, which is this picture right here, as a prime spot for fishing, hunting, and gathering. And I knew this spot as a great spot to sit with my parents and watch the whales swim by. So this picture here is of me when I was, I don't know, 5 or 6, with one of the sheep that my parents and I took care of. His name was Herman. And so when we lived on the island, we lived in a little mobile home and raised sheep. So that's a little bit about who I am and where I come from. But I think that all these experiences really helped instill a deep connection and relationship with the land and the waters that surrounded me, and has brought me to where I am now with my passion for the environment and sustainability. So this brings me to my master's research, which is titled Weaving and Respecting Local Indigenous Nations' Ways of Knowing and Being in Land-Based Learning with the UBC Farm Wonders Summer Camps. And so with this research, I wanted to look at what the current state of Indigenous-inspired land-based learning was at the summer camps, and then also look at how we could, I assumed that the engagement would be minimal, and so I also wanted to look at how we could increase and respectfully honor more Indigenous ways of knowing into the curriculum of what we're teaching these kids. And then I also wanted to look at what implications this case study may have for other youth outdoor programming in other places. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the methodologies that I drew from to design my research, because I think that's pretty important, and then also the methods that I used to collect the actual data. So the first one I wanted to talk about is the principle of two-eyed seeing, which was created by Elder Albert Marshall. Oops, sorry. And Elder Marshall describes this concept as viewing the world through both an Indigenous lens and a Western lens. And so I think this theoretical framework really helped shape my research because of the co-learning aspect, which is embedded in two-eyed seeing and also in my own research. And then I also want to acknowledge that making these changes within the summer camp are still operating under a colonial institution, but indigenizing and meaningfully including local Musqueam knowledge in the curriculum is a necessary step towards ongoing reconciliation, which is outlined in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action 62 and 63. Another guiding principle that I keep close to my heart throughout all my work is that of the 4 R's of respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. And the 4 R's were first developed in discussion of First Nations and higher education, but I really believe that they have a place in all our connections with and relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Though the concept of the 4 R's has been adapted many times since it was created in 2001, I draw from the original of Kirkness and Barnhart's 4 R's to help shape the outlook of my work. And then now I'm going to talk about participatory action research, which is pretty fundamental to this case study. But participatory action research is an approach that focuses on using the real life experiences of the community that emphasize collaboration, reflection, and action to create meaningful change. So just a little bit of context of what I did this summer. The Farm Wonders summer camps are on the UBC farm, as Rob mentioned earlier. And they're just a few steps up the driveway from Huitsitsum, which is the Musqueam Garden, which means the place where we grow. And I worked at the summer camps this past summer as an instructor, where I was able to experience how the camps are run and their level of engagement with Indigenous worldviews and also Musqueam worldviews. And because of my position and direct involvement in the camps, I was able to carry out participatory action research. And with camp staff, including myself, as well as the curriculum creators and the managers, all engaging in identifying issues, shaping the research, and implementing solutions throughout the 8-week cycle of camp. I believe that this is a participatory action research project, even if it might be on a smaller scale than other participatory action research projects. And then the 4 R's that I also mentioned earlier are deeply central to the cycles of reflection and learning and changes of practice that happen throughout the summer. And then as for my data collection methods, throughout the summer, I carried out participant and environmental observation. I took field notes. Summer camp staff and I reflected on our experiences daily, weekly, and then also at the end of the summer. And then I also conducted semi-structured interviews with the camp staff and teacher candidates who are in the teacher education program who had worked with us as summer camp staff in the 3 weeks leading up to working with the kids. And that was part of their community field experiences, which is part of their program. And then I also interviewed an inclusion support worker who worked with us for 1 week to help support a student with intellectual disabilities, because I thought that this would show an outside view or perspective of how the camps were operating. And then at the end of the summer, I hosted 2 potlucks for all the summer camp staff who were available, and just to hold a focus group. And so at these potlucks, I'd prepared some questions for us to collaborate together on, and reflect and discuss our summer camp experiences, and then think about improvements and how we could suggest recommendations for improving them. And I felt that a potluck was a suitable act of reciprocity to say thank you to the staff for participating in my research, which was really important to me to give back, even if it was in a small way. Okay, now I wanted to talk a little bit about the terms and definitions that are really prevalent in my research. I've mentioned land-based learning a lot. It was in my title, but I haven't talked about what it actually is yet. And so then these other 2 terms, place-based learning and outdoor education, are also really integral to my research and the space that I'm working in. So this is a table that I created with some of the strategies to help understand the differences and the similarities. But I'm also going to talk after this about context-specific examples from summer camp. So just to distinguish from these 3 terms, land-based learning is the only one that explicitly emphasizes Indigenous knowledge and ways of being. And so land-based learning views land itself as the teacher, which is demonstrated in Leanne Simpson's Land as Pedagogy. And then place-based learning differs because it's a Western approach to using land as a tool to validate the teachings that were provided by the teacher, and doesn't necessarily view land as being engaged or animated in the act of teaching. So this could look like using the land as a living classroom, or taking your students on a field trip after you talk to them about some specific content. And then finally, outdoor education technically is any education that takes place outdoors, but it's morphed into this concept of talking about risk management and risky play, and also environmental stewardship, though these also often have land-based and place-based implications. And then I also included decolonizing and indigenizing here on this table, because I just want to reiterate how central it is to my research and emphasizes my goal of acknowledging and respecting place through land-based learning in the camps. Okay, so now I wanted to talk a little bit about the examples of these 3 terms and how I saw them play out last summer. So for land-based learning, the most prominent example is that each week the campers would harvest various plants, berries, and herbs. So things like blueberries that were grown intentionally on the farm, or wild Himalayan blackberries that we would see out on walks, which are invasive. But there's also native berries like wild strawberries, like you see here, and thimbleberries. And so sometimes we had harvesting activities which were intentional, like we would harvest them with a purpose. We would try to bake with them, or maybe use them to make natural paints to have activities and things like that. But other times, because they're kids, a lot of the time they're just picking the berries off the bushes. So one thing that we really tried to ingrain in them as staff was the importance of being respectful to the plants, and acknowledging that taking a berry was not necessarily something that they could take without any consequences, and instead was a gift from the land itself. And so we drew from the Indigenous principles of the honorable harvest, which we had learned from Potawatomi scholar Robin Wall-Kimmerer. Her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, was really integral to this, and we used the adaptation Braiding Sweetgrass for Young Adults to help talk to the children about this. And so a lot of the principles that come from the honorable harvest are things like being grateful, always asking before taking, asking the plant itself before taking, never taking the first or the last, and lots of other great principles that are great words to live by. And I feel like if there's one thing that the kids took away each week, it was these ideas of the honorable harvest and how to engage with the land in a meaningful way. And even though we were the ones who were sharing this knowledge with the children, the plants, the berries, and the herbs themselves were the ones who were teaching the children directly. So moving on to place-based learning, though it emphasizes the importance of the local place, it doesn't consider, like I said before, the land to be animated or a teacher. And so an example that comes to mind from camp is on Thursdays, we would have something that we called Bee Day, where every morning we would tell them stories about bees or read them books about bees, and they would play games. And then in the afternoon, we would walk across the farm to go look at the beehives that are available there. And so viewed through a Western lens, this would be considered place-based learning because we taught them something in the morning and then we're validating it with real life experience. But with deeper engagement and intentionality of fostering a deeper connection to nature and even an understanding of an Indigenous perspective of bees, this could also be land-based learning with the bees being the teachers. Okay, and then finally, outdoor education. Oh, okay, I won't worry about it. Outdoor education, like I mentioned earlier, is just any education that happens outside. So this could be like teaching math in an outdoor setting. And so I don't necessarily have a lot of examples of this from camp because as the summer camp staff, we really tried to include elements of land-based and place-based education and learning. But I thought that this picture of books would be helpful because reading a book to a child outside could be considered outdoor education. But our curation of the books that we read to them was really meaningful and we tried to include elements of land and place-based learning. So it's not a perfect example, but something that I wanted to share. Okay, and then now that I'm currently in my data analysis stage, I wanted to share, oh no, sorry. I wanted to share a little mini code book that I created to kind of share with you what stage I'm at in my research. And so this is an example of the one theme and some sub themes, and then some quotes that I thought were relevant and that would be interesting to share. And so I just think that it's important here to visualize what stage I'm at in my research. So I decided to share the theme of decolonizing the Farm Wonders summer camps, and then with these various sub themes as well. But I'd like to focus on one quote, which I think really hammers home the significance of my research in this context. And so this was from one of the teacher candidates that I interviewed who worked with us in the weeks leading up to camp. And they said, "You're literally on Musqueam land and across the driveway from the garden. And you're saying that this is not an Indigenous camp, but everything that you're doing on the farm should be rooted in and acknowledging the Indigenous people that came before." And so, like I said, I just think that this is really important to see the necessity and importance of this type of research in this context, but also in outdoor programming in other places too. Okay, and then finally, I just wanted to end on where I'm at now and what's next for me and my research specifically. So I have a really unique opportunity, hopefully, pending funding, where I'm hoping to apply for this new position of Children and Youth Program Coordinator. And so this would mean that in addition to my thesis and the recommendations that I'm providing, that I would actually be able to be the person to make those changes and enact those recommendations in the summer camps. And so some of the recommendations that I hope to provide to the farm that I think would be helpful to know are things like more training is required in all aspects. So not just like outdoor education and how to talk to children in an outdoor context and talk to them about difficult topics, but also how to incorporate Musqueam knowledge and Indigenous knowledge in a meaningful and respectful way in an outdoor education context. And then more structure and supervision is also required, as well as better working conditions to encourage people to apply for the position and come work at the farm. So I think that this summer went really well because the people who were employed at the farm as summer camp staff were really engaged in environment and sustainability and really just cared about how we can further this connection of Indigenous knowledge and Musqueam knowledge into the curriculum in a good way. But there's no real way to guarantee that that's going to happen again. And so, yeah, I think that structure and supervision is really necessary here. And then just in a camp context, I think that inclusion support is really needed. So for children who might have intellectual and physical disabilities, there needs to be some more structured support there as well so that more people can access the camps and that they can feel safe sending their children to camp. And then also in the same vein, financial support for camp families would be helpful so that more people and maybe lower income families can access the camps and they can be a place where all people are welcome. In addition to my thesis, I'm hoping to write and create a land-based learning toolkit for emerging educators. So as Rob was mentioning, he works in the Department of Educational Studies. And so being able to provide emerging teachers with information on how they can meaningfully and respectfully engage with land-based learning in their classrooms when they enter the workforce, I think would be a great way of giving back as well. And then I just want to end by saying thank you to everybody who's helped me with this specific project, who's outlined here, but also all the people who continue to support me behind the scenes as well. So thank you. Okay. Any questions?
Maybe more on the children who are participating in the camp, like how old are they, where they're from, or like why they're here. And also I'm wondering like if you have interviewed some of the children or the parents on like their perceptions or their feedback on.
Yeah, awesome. Great question. Thank you. I will repeat it. So the question is kind of about the demographics of the children who are coming to the UBC farm camp. And then if I interviewed or talked to any of the kids explicitly for my research as well. So to answer the first part of the question, every week we have 30 kids come to camp and usually they're unique. So usually sometimes there would be kids who would have 2 weeks of camp, but usually it was, most kids just had one. But this is like not super relevant to my research, but just an interesting tidbit, I guess. A lot of the students who are coming to us, oh, sorry, let me say the ages, which is like about 5 to 10 or 4 to 11. But a lot of the students who came to us were actually from overseas. And so I had the opportunity to practice my Mandarin. My mom is from Taiwan, and I used to be fluent, but am no longer. But a lot of them didn't speak any English. And so I was really pulling out the stops trying to practice my Mandarin with these children are different from adults. They will tell you when you're saying something completely wrong. But so that was interesting. I really was not expecting that. I was expecting most of the students coming to us to be like from the UBC community or like from the greater Vancouver area where they're able to experience a farm in a relatively urban space. But yeah, it was kind of a mix, which I was surprised about. And some people come from like the United States and like vacation in Vancouver, which is something new to me. And then as for your question about actually interviewing the children, I didn't feel comfortable doing that and I didn't apply for that as part of my BREB. I think when you bring children into a research space, it kind of can make them a vulnerable population and they might not be they just might not know exactly what you're asking of them. And so I didn't feel good about that, but it is something interesting to explore and maybe in the future. But instead of interviewing them and talking to them explicitly about these questions that I'm having for my research project, I would take field notes and like write down anecdotes from camp that I felt demonstrated like these things that I was looking at, like land-based learning and place-based learning. But yeah, no real direct question asking from me. But yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The differences are not so much in maturity. It's more conceptual.
Yeah.
So I'm curious on how transparent you think those differences are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about land-based and place-based learning and the differences in outlook and then also engagement with the kids about the differences. The simple answer is no. I didn't engage in participant observation in that sense, like seeing if they engage differently in these land-based activities compared to place-based activities. But one thing that I will say is that I was having quite a lot of difficulty myself personally, trying to distinguish between land-based learning and place-based learning, especially in different spaces where I was reading about land-based learning and thinking that maybe this is something that settlers are not meant to be engaging in. And so I was really questioning my entire research project because it's kind of based all around that. And so I sought out support from the Indigenous pedagogist at UBC Childcare, and I talked to her about it because I felt that she was the most relevant person for me to talk to be able to feel good about the way that I'm approaching my research and also making sure that I'm doing it in a respectful way. And so I talked to her about using the term land-based learning because someone had told me that only Indigenous people should be the ones who are talking about this. And so actually on this slide, it was her quote who is the first one. So I was talking to her about how to meaningfully engage in land-based learning as a settler. And she said, you should be talking about this if you're someone who's interested in it and you think that you have a position where you can actually make change in these children. And she said that we need to stop saying no to things and instead support each other and work together. And so that really helped me solidify my confidence in the term and also in differentiating between the other two like kind of Western approaches. So I'm not sure if I answered your question exactly, but I hope that kind of gained a little bit of insight into how I approached it. Okay, yeah. Mm. Yeah, thanks for your question. So the question is about if I'm hopefully going to be able to have the opportunity to connect with similar spaces and similar programs outside of the UBC farm. And it's funny you say that because kind of when I first came to UBC, that was what I wanted to look at first. I wanted to see if land-based programs at UBC and also at other universities, especially like Trent University has a great one. I wanted to see the differences and what would allow a land-based learning program to succeed. So I was kind of more focused on not necessarily action research, but more just yeah, looking at the differences and the similarities and how to create a positive program. For this project, I don't think that I will, but that's something that interests me and that I would be interested in looking at further. But maybe when it comes to my lit review and when I'm talking about my background, I could talk a little bit about that. But I feel at this point in my research, I've completed kind of all the data collection and I'm kind of just about to get into writing. And so that's where I'm at now and what I'm thinking about. But yeah, thank you for your question. Is that it? Okay. Thanks.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Shilton, and I have two wonderful supervisors. They could not be here today, unfortunately, so they're joining virtually. I'm sure if they were here introducing me, they would have nothing but glowing things to say about me and my research. But instead, I'll be introducing myself. I've got an introductory slide. But yeah, just to get into it. So the title of my talk is An Addictive E-Waste Problem. And I think my goal with this presentation is that you walk away a little bit more curious about your relationship to the devices and the electronics in your life. So I know we all come from pretty different sort of research backgrounds. And so I'm going to spend most of the time kind of talking about how I came to sort of form this question and why I think it's important. And then I'll spend a bit of time talking about how I've structured my research to answer this question, and then sort of quickly go into the results so far because they are still in progress. So to get started and kind of how I came into this research, I did my undergraduate degree in mechatronics engineering at the University of Waterloo. And then I spent 3 years working in consumer electronics as an electrical engineer. And I think it was there I really got a firsthand insight into sort of the devices that we're making, the e-waste they create, and the challenges of recycling them and recovering the materials. And that's why I decided to sort of return to school and pursue this master's with my research topic sort of being about the environmental impact of electronics. I just wanted to highlight quickly this really interesting project I took on last year with Dr. Satish Gopalakrishnan on the right. We developed this course called Elect 200R with Millen from IRES, where we took electrical engineering students. We taught them about the impacts of electronics. We taught them how to repair electronics, and then they volunteered those skills at a local repair cafe. And I think the sort of takeaway from that I thought was interesting is that I think a lot of engineers and engineering students are really excited to engage with sustainability, but it's not always clear to them how their skills can best serve, especially with like electrical engineering. Obviously, environmental engineering is different. But I think if we can kind of get creative, I think they're really excited to sort of participate and learn. And that was a really sort of eye-opening experience for me because I wasn't quite sure how they were going to respond to the curriculum. So getting into my research, I wanted to kind of get us all onto the same page. So, you know, we talk about electronics, the sustainability impacts aren't usually the first thing we think about. So the way we kind of think about the impact of electronics is through this life cycle. So a life cycle assessment is looking at the impacts at every stage of the life cycle. And for almost all consumer devices, this is how we sort of break it down. So at each stage, kind of the impacts that we're concerned about are going to be a little bit different. So at the beginning, material extraction, this is a biggie. So there's a ton, like hundreds of materials that go into making electronics, and almost all of them have high energy and greenhouse gas emissions. These materials are hard to get out of the ground, they're hard to process, and they need to be transported. Not only that though, and I apologize, I know this chart's not super easy to read, but this isn't an environmental life cycle assessment, it's actually a social life cycle assessment. So it's looking at these materials and looking at the social and ethical impacts that surround sort of their extraction and collection. So it's looking at things like global peace index, child labor, and fair salary. Moving on, once we get those materials out of the ground, they move into the manufacturing process. And I have this circle together because usually the environmental life cycle assessments will group these impacts under one umbrella called material extraction and manufacturing. And this is typically the biggest part, the biggest impact of making electronics. So to put it visually, on the right there is an environmental impact assessment for a laptop measured in kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And that big blue sort of slice is sort of all from manufacturing. So once they're built, there isn't as much of an impact, but building it takes a lot of emissions, energy, water. Transport, this will vary a lot depending on where it's made and who is using it. But in Canada, most of the time that looks like shipping electronics from China to us here, typically on a boat. And then use for things like cell phones is going to be pretty low. But then when you get into things like maybe washing and drying machines, or if we want to stretch the definition of consumer electronics to include cars, then all of a sudden use becomes the name of the game. And you're thinking about how high efficiency is it, what fuel is it using, and where is that fuel coming from? And then at end of life, obviously this depends on the pathway. Is it being recycled? But as of today, most electronics aren't. And so they're ending up sort of in the trash. And then we're talking about environmental toxicity of those sort of materials leaching into the soil, human health impacts as unofficial material recovery streams emerge and people try and collect sort of those materials back. And then also material loss impacts. You know, we spent a lot of energy to get those things out of the ground, and now they're in a form that's not usable and are kind of lost to us. But thankfully, I'm not the first person to be thinking about the impact of electronics on the environment. And so already a lot of research has been done into interventions that can be used to reduce their impact. The two main intervention points that people are most excited about are product design and end of life. So on the product design side, we're hearing things like design for repairability, using more sustainable materials, designing for energy efficiency. And then at end of life, the topics we're talking about are, you know, how do we sort of keep these devices from ending up in a landfill in 100 different ways? So required manufacturing, recycling, improving access to repair, improved access to donation, improving repair technology itself, particularly around batteries. People are really excited about how can we get those materials out of batteries back into a usable form. Taking it a step further though, people have also already been thinking about how can we sort of create policies or force companies to kind of do these interventions that we know would improve the impact. So kind of the leader of sustainable product design interventions is the EU. Usually they are the leader. So the one we talk about is the ESPR, or the Eco Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. They have really neat rules for different devices around sort of what they need to do related to labeling and energy efficiency, repairability. But one sort of key limitation is that the ESPR only applies to 29 specific products from sort of the following categories. So like small consumer electronics or sort of home appliances. So then as a master's student who was sort of looking for a question, my thought was kind of, what is falling through the cracks of these 29 sort of product categories, or what is overlooked by current sustainability initiatives? And there actually kind of is a word for it already. And that word is invisible e-waste. So invisible e-waste is e-waste that goes unnoticed due to its nature or appearance, leading consumers to overlook its recyclable potential. So typically these devices are small, inexpensive, designed for limited use, or they are Internet of Things enabled devices from product categories that previously had not contained electronics. That last one's a little bit wordy, but it's basically just like batteries, technology, LEDs are in everything. My favorite example of that one is birthday cards that sort of sing when you open them. Like that's a battery, that's e-waste, but no one would think to recycle that. Another way to think about it would be if your laptop broke, you would probably take it to get repaired. But if your laptop charger broke, you'd probably throw it out and order a new one. So that charger, that's invisible e-waste. So this leads me to my research question. What policy interventions could be effective in reducing the environmental impact of invisible e-waste products? And when I began looking into the topic of sort of invisible e-waste, there was one device that people in this space are growing increasingly concerned about. And that is sort of e-cigarettes or electronic nicotine delivery systems, or vapes. Hence the name of my title, An Addictive E-Waste Problem. So these are two headlines that have come out recently. The one on the left is the US throws out 4.5 disposable vapes per second. And the one on the right, vape warning after fires in recycling center. This poor recycling center in the UK, they've had 5 fires this past month from people throwing out vapes, and then they explode when the battery is compacted. So for those of you who may not be familiar, vaping devices are battery-operated devices that people use to inhale an aerosol, which typically contains nicotine, flavorings, and other chemicals. And to give you sort of a scope of the scale, in 2022, 44 million vapes were sold, resulting in 42 million kilograms of e-waste, with 130,000 kilograms of lithium ending up in the trash. And that number was taken from the EU e-waste monitor, where they specifically called out vapes as like a high concern e-waste product that they're not quite sure how to handle. And sort of beyond just the fact of the scale, there's sort of other dimensions that make them a particularly challenging sort of problem for e-waste and e-waste recyclers. The top one, competing policy priorities. So it's not like we don't know that these are a problem and we don't know what to do about it. It's just that Canadian policymakers are so busy trying to figure out what to do related to, do we promote these devices as a smoking cessation tool, or do we try and limit them to protect youth health? That there just really hasn't been room in the conversation to sort of understand the e-waste impacts. 2, recycling gray zone. So there are existing sort of e-waste recycling facilities that you could argue these should fall into, but a lot of them don't want to accept them because they're considered hazardous waste due to the like nicotine solution and the fact that people kind of use them with their mouths. But then also the tightly integrated product design. So phones and laptops are often held together by screws, but these are sort of small, cheaply made devices. And so they're almost exclusively held together with glue, adhesives, or sort of these breakable clips. And so they're really hard to take apart and create a recycling system to get the battery out of it. And then finally, also just the scale. These devices kind of came onto the market and then immediately exploded, and our recycling systems haven't had time to keep up, and we haven't had time to develop a system to respond to all of the waste that's being created by them. So when I originally created this question, what policy interventions could be effective in reducing invisible e-waste impacts? Initially, I was going to look into sort of 100 different devices and sort of see how they were all different. But I thought it might be more useful to kind of deep dive into sort of one device and one that's particularly challenging. And then hopefully we could use those learnings to sort of have kind of a cascading effect across other e-waste, invisible e-waste products. So specifically, I'm going to be looking at vapes throughout sort of this research. And I've structured my research into sort of 3 categories. First, characterize the product, understand the consumer, and then develop policy solutions. And what that looks like more specifically I started off by sort of collecting a bunch of devices and taking them apart and sorting them into their constituent materials. I did some material characterization to understand what they're made of, because it's a lot of mystery plastics and metals. And then I'm currently in the process of doing a life cycle assessment to quantify the impacts and understand where they're coming from. I expect it mostly is going to be the battery, but it'd be good to sort of have the numbers on that. And then two, I've been sort of surveying consumers. So one, just to quantify purchase and disposal behaviors. This data just really hasn't been collected yet. So we don't know what types of devices people are buying. Are they recycling them? Do they even know about recycling? But then two, kind of understand the motivations of and barriers towards sustainable behavior. So why are some people choosing reusable devices and others aren't? So kind of understanding what's important to people who use these products. And then three, I'm hoping to kind of feed the learnings from the first two to sort of end my research by providing policy recommendations to the Canadian government that would hopefully reduce the environmental impact of vape products. So to quickly kind of flash how my research has been going. I collected a bunch of devices on the left from top to bottom, purely disposable, so they can't be refilled or recharged. The one below, they can't be refilled, but they can be recharged, so they have a slightly larger capacity, refillable and rechargeable. And then at the bottom are specialty ones, which sort of have screens, which I was like, oh my goodness, like there's already so much e-waste and now you're putting screens on them. Like, we got to stop. And then I took them apart and I sorted them into their components. And then for the cases, I took samples and characterized the metals and the plastics. And then I've been feeding all that into an LCA software, which is not very pretty. So I don't have any screenshots of that. Understanding the consumer, I developed a survey, which took a really long time because this was new to me. And then I did a 50-person pilot and I got a lot of good feedback. And then we sent it out to 500 people and I've been going through the process of sorting through that. This graph is, are you aware of any vape recycling programs available to you? And 87% of people said no, which was really discouraging. And then finally, the policy solution. So I actually kind of had to come up with these at the start because it guided what devices I selected and the questions I was asking consumers. But the two I kind of came up with that, or the four I came up with that I think could potentially work are, one, banning disposable vapes. I didn't come up with it, but it's been done in a lot of countries, but I think it's a really effective measure. Interestingly, though, when this has been implemented, it's typically to protect youth because the argument is that they're getting their older friends or siblings to buy them for them, and they'll buy them a single-use device, but they're not going to buy them compatible pods. And so that's where a lot of that argument has came from. It really hasn't been about the environment. But then two, New Zealand, and this one was about the environment, they're requiring all vapes to have removable batteries. So I think these two, when used in conjunction, are really compelling because then even those devices that are refillable, those sort of lithium polymer batteries only have so many cycles. So eventually when that device reaches end of life, you could still recover the battery. So I think those are a really effective combination. And then end of life regulations, the two I kind of thought of were the e-waste policy that we currently have, and then also our beverage container policy. So for e-waste right now, we have an environmental handling fee at the time of purchase that funds sort of e-waste recycling programs. And then bottles, as you're familiar with, you probably pay a deposit like 5 cents. And then when you return it, you get that money back. And so that's kind of useful in that it incentivizes device return, because one barrier is that people sort of want to get rid of these devices. They don't want to carry it around and wait till they can go to a store. And so having a deposit return would create a bigger incentive for people to do that. So checking in kind of on where I'm at in my research, I'm sort of, I know it looks like I'm very close, but there's a lot of writing to do, but I'm kind of on the last step of each of them. So doing the life cycle assessment, kind of going through the statistical analysis for the survey. And then once those are done, I'll be able to sort of complete my final policy recommendations. Yeah, so I wanted to thank everyone who helped me. I got a lot of support in this project. Show my bibliography. And then, yeah, thank you so much for listening.
I wanted to ask about the recyclability of these products. So you were talking about how like there's fluids and adhesives and stuff in the clip. That's making it more difficult to recycle them, right?
Yeah, so the question was, I said that these devices are glued together. Doesn't that make them hard to recycle? Yeah, exactly. Not to jump ahead to my research, but that's kind of what I found. So initially I was really excited about the idea of recycling. But as someone who had to sit down and take them apart, like it was taking like an hour per device. And you could argue that like, as you're doing more, you could like scale them up and develop procedures that would make that quicker. But I can't imagine a world where the economics of sort of peeling these devices apart would be in any way like financially viable. And it's also like, it's hazardous. There's a nicotine solution. You have to wear like gloves and PPE, but then also there's like a lithium battery in there, and they're just like, they're not like double A's, like they're just these pouches. And if you puncture them, they can catch on fire. So you have to go really slowly. And I'm like, who's going to do that? Like, so I think, and that's the thing. I think before I took these devices apart, recycling sounded like a great idea. Like on paper, I'm like, yeah, we should recycle these devices. And then I actually went through the process of what you would have to do to recycle them. And I was like, no way, like no one's recycling this. So I think product design regulations are going to be more effective, like banning disposable vapes and then having the batteries be removable. Because then even if you are recycling them, now you're not risking the people handling it, their safety. So yeah, that was a really good question. Yeah. Yeah.
My question kind of twofold. One, anecdotally, you don't have to do specific here. Do you think these shops are like actually recycling vapes? Like when people come and contribute their vape to like some bin, like where are they actually going? And two, for the lowest rung, in the photo that you showed of all the vapes, are the ones with LED screens that, by the way, if you don't know, they're touch screens, like iPhones. Those devices, are they closer to being recyclable than like, I don't know, like a Jewel or something like that, like a super flimsy thing? Like has the complexity of those devices made it so like the battery is a part of the design?
Yeah. Okay, two questions. I'll start with the first. The first is people I've talked to in my survey, they'll say like they're taking them to these shops and they'll collect them in this bin that you can put them in. And then it's like, where are they going? Because then I go and talk to e-waste recyclers and they're like, we don't accept them. So honestly, I don't know. Like I think some of them have found e-waste recyclers who are willing to take them, but there are already kind of like dubious thoughts around these like sort of reverse logistics supplied. Like, are they actually getting recycled or are they just getting paid to be shipped off? Like, there's not a lot of accountability. This is sort of just like an interesting story though. I went to one of the vape stores and they said people were coming in to collect the vapes from them to use for hobbyist projects. So one was like using them to build drone batteries, like 15 vape batteries to create a drone. And the other was creating like sort of lighting systems for festivals. So there's kind of this like unofficial battery economy that's popping up, which is really interesting. So yeah, I actually don't know where they're going. And that's the thing. That's also something I worry about. Like, okay, we incentivize vape collection to these stores and then they just end up in this like murky waste recycling stream. So yeah. And then the second question is that, do those devices with screens that are more complex with LEDs, are they easier to recycle than maybe the cheaper, flimsier ones? And I'd say actually the answer is no, because it comes down to like what materials we have effective recycling streams for. And like PCB electronics, like those hard circuit boards, there's some like recycling. It's not great. Batteries, I think, are the best. Plastics, if they're a known composition, they're okay. Like I think recycling is only effective for electronics if you are the manufacturer. So when Apple collects iPhones, they're really good at recycling them because they know the grade of aluminum, they know how it's built, they know how to take it apart. But when you're collecting these like mystery electronics, the battery is the only thing that's labeled. And unless you're going to take the time to figure out what they are, it's hard to create a recycling stream that's effective without downcycling it into like mystery plastic goo. So I'd say the easiest one to recycle would just be the smallest because there's less materials and there's less things happening, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Good question. Oh, sorry. Really excited.
That 75% of the Apple event, and two, getting in the way of the regulation that's enforcing design on screen. So there's a few.
Yeah. Yeah, two good questions. The first one is, what percentage does invisible e-waste make up? And I didn't include the statistic because it's a little discouraging. And that's kind of because e-waste statistics are reported by mass of the entire system. So these invisible e-waste products are competing against like cars and washing machines and HVAC systems. And so by weight, they're representing like, I think it's less than 5%. Like it's pretty small, but a lot of those are made of things like aluminum and steel that can be recycled by weight, whereas these are almost 100% battery. So I think if someone were to map their like greenhouse gas emissions, they would represent more than 5%, like it'd be like 15 or 20. But because it's just by weight is what we have, they don't look like that big of a problem, which I think is why people haven't really been like talking about it, because it's sort of like a rounding error at the bottom of the stream. And then the other question is how hard it is to make product regulation. And yeah, no, so that's something I was thinking about because I was looking at the EU and I was like, why did they only pick 29 categories? Like, why didn't they say, if you're selling anything with a battery, it has to be removable? Like, why can't it be like broader? And I think their argument was that just like they went in and they realized it was easier to go product by product and make specific regulations because you have to understand like who the players are, what their manufacturing is, what they care about. And then there's like lobbies and they're like negotiating with them. And so I think what I imagine they're going to do is they're going to keep growing it, but they are going product by product in their regulation. Yeah, but I don't know, like, especially like with phones, like Apple and Google, like they're at Congress all the time being like, you can't tell us to make our phones more repairable. And then they also have an argument where they like say like, you don't understand what it takes to make a phone, which is like that sort of like knowledge gap between sort of electronics manufacturing and policymakers that is, I think, pretty hard to bridge. Yeah. Bye.
That, have you, looked into the brands or the companies that manufactures the vapes? Because, they're like like a lot of like small making those vapes, it might be feel less, motivated, or they feel less responsible, or, in terms of this kind of social or environmental responsibility?
Yeah.
Or do you have any like leading brand which can, initiate this kind of responsible manufacturing norm or something?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question was kind of related to like, who are the brands who are making these products? Are there a lot of them? Are there a few? Do they feel any sense of like environmental responsibility? And that's what I think the problem is. So if you look at the market, there are like almost all vapes, the plastics are coming out of China, and there are like hundreds of different brands. And I think there are maybe, I was trying to figure out the supply chains, but I think there's maybe like 8 factories that make these like basic devices, and then they get sold to like other companies who label them. So that's why you'll see ones that are shaped the same but with different labels. And so it's sort of this like diffusion of responsibility because it's like they're a lot of these vape companies don't control their own supply chains. They're buying them, they're shipping them to the US and Canada, filling them with the nicotine solution here, and then selling them. So there are a few big players like Juul, but like honestly right now they're all getting like beaten up about sort of youth and youth vaping, and like they're getting like Juul got banned in San Francisco, and so I think these companies right now are spending all of their money trying to prove that their devices are like healthy and that they're like good for smoking cessation. That's similar to policymakers. They don't have time to even think about e-waste, and consumers aren't asking for it, maybe more importantly. Yeah. Amanda? Yeah. Yeah, good point. The question was sort of about if there seems to be more like public goodwill around protecting health, could you tap into that for like double wins with the environment? And I've sort of stayed away from the public health stuff just because the data is not very good right now. Like just some people are saying it's a healthier alternative to smoking. Others are saying it's like worse. And so I'm like, I don't want to make any recommendations that are about to be like sort of gotten rid of pretty immediately. But I think the only other kind of like public health I think the only other public health or public good I can get into is some people have started campaigns related to like littering. Like they're like, look, there's like vapes on the street. Like this is awful. It's like photos of like beaches and bus stops where you see them on the ground. And people get really upset about that. Like it's my neighborhood. We shouldn't have this. So I think I think it would still be the same argument that we need to ban disposable vapes because no one's littering something that they can refill. But you could also come at it from a littering angle as well as like a protecting the kids angle. So I think those could be like good messaging because like e-waste is not, people don't really get emotional over e-waste. Like they're not calling their local policymakers over e-waste. So yeah, I guess that's my answer. Cool. Well, I think that's about time. Thank you so much for the question.